All right, well, go ahead and get started, and we'll be able to do that. So just wanted to do a quick check to make sure that I can be heard okay. If Frank can come off mute and let me know.
Yes, we can hear you.
And you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Perfect, thank you. Technology is a wonderful thing. All right, everybody, thank you very much for participating in Sudarshan's first Pigments 101 Lunch and Learn series. We are excited to provide you some additional information about pigments in this unprecedented times when we're all working, a lot of us working from home offices or being limited in some way in the office area. We wanted to provide you with some additional learning in the pigment area. And so we've put together this series that will be on a monthly basis. It'd be an open forum, like a Zoom meeting like this. And the intention here is for about a 30-minute technical presentation, and then followed up with about 10 minutes of question and answers. If you do have any questions, please use the chat button for any questions that you have along the way. We'll reserve the questions till the end of the period. I have my other teammates here with me to help me with the mechanics of this. So we will record those questions and organize them, and then I will get some help with answering any of the questions at the end. As Frank had mentioned, everybody is on mute so that we have as clear a call as we can. If there's any specific questions that you have for Sudarshan, you can follow up with us afterwards, or if there's any additional information that you need in there. I am recording this talk, so if you would like to refer to it, we will have that available for you as well. Without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and get started with just a quick introduction of Sudarshan. As you know, we're an Indian-based pigment manufacturing company. We've been in the business for nearly 70 years, producing organic pigments of a wide portfolio, as well as effect mica pigments for all industries, plastics, coatings, and inks, as well as in our cosmetic line as well. So with our first session with the series is, okay, let's see, there we go. For today, we'll talk about at least the origin and history of pigments, and a little bit about color, a little comparison about pigments and dyes. Both of them are colorants, but they're very different. I'll introduce you into ways to classify a pigment and some important things to consider when selecting a pigment for your application. And then a little bit of a heads up on our next installment of the Pigment 101 Lunch and Learn series. So without further ado, with our color your business, making your business successful. Let me just turn my phone off here real quick so that it's the first, first question to ask is, how important is color to your business? And when you are selling a color to an end user, really your intent is to for that product when it reaches the shelf or the lot or wherever it's going. Does it attract attention to the customer? Does the color that you create inspire confidence in the product as well as in the supplier? And then a big portion of color, of course, can be brand recognition. We all know Coke Red and Pepsi Blue. You see those colors and you know automatically what the product represents. And color is going to be a factor in answering all those questions as you begin to put together colors for your end product. And studies have shown that 70% of the buying decision is made at the shelf on the lot. It can be a very personal choice. Sometimes it's not a, it's more a personal choice versus a rational choice. Customers tend to reach past a product that may not have an attractive color versus a fresher one, or maybe a brighter color or a little bit more style to it. Again, color can make your end product business much more successful. Pigments are obviously used in all applications, and as I stated earlier, Sudarshan is involved with pigments for all applications. Obviously, the obvious ones are coatings and inks and plastics. Maybe not so obvious ones might be things like floor coatings or grout and tile printing, wallpaper, ribbons and tape. All those things will have pigments of some sort in them to attract attention to their end use. Historically, color has always come from nature in very early times. We all know about cave paintings and other histories where there's cloth dyeing. So color has been around since the early times of man, and you've been able to pull that color from nature, either from plants, animals, or minerals from the ground. Excuse me. From animals, we can get pearlescence from shells. We've taken ink from octopuses and created a form of a Prussian blue from animal blood. From plants and vegetables, we can take dyes from different vegetables and flowers out there. By burning cellulosic type of materials, we can get the soot that will give us some black color. And of course, from the ground, getting the natural iron oxides and also some mica from the ground that will give us those colorants from nature. Unfortunately, there are some drawbacks to natural colorants. They typically are very weak in tint strength. Coloristically, they are limited, more on the dirtier side. Their permanence is not great in a lot of cases, and they're very hard in their texture, causing them to be very difficult to disperse in the ultimate medium that you're trying to use. So obviously, some very brilliant folks came along and developed the synthetic manufacture and refining of pigments to be able to solve all of those problems that the natural sources provided. So of course, we're getting the better strength, uniformity, and cleaner and brighter and more attractive coloration from the synthetic made colorants. as well as addressing the dispersibility issues with a softer texture and easier to grind. When it comes to pigments and where the color comes from, it's always a combination of light interacting with those pigment particles. The larger the particle size of that pigment will ends up being will dictate whether it's going to be an opaque type pigment. So the larger ones are going to be more opaque, and they're going to absorb more of the light and scatter and reflect less and scatter and scatter some more, which will give it its opaqueness. The smaller ones, of course, are going to give you the transparency if that's what's needed in your end use. In the small ones, they're going to absorb and transmit those particles or the streams of light to be able to give you that transparent effect. And as related to light solvents, and solvents can be a wide variety of chemistries in this respect. There's a relationship between the two as far as whether it becomes a transmitting or absorption type of a product based on its solvency. So on the organic color side, we've got our pigments, dyes, toners. We've got a couple of several types of dyes that we have, where we've got the soluble ones, which are definitely absorbers, and some insoluble ones that can be reflectings as well. On the inorganic colorant, we've got the metal oxides, are CICPs, which are the complex inorganic color pigments. Say that 3 times fast. And of course, some phosphorescent pigments in there, and they're all going to be insoluble. The effect pigments make up the interference type of pigments, where the light is interfered with by the actual platelet itself. So it either will reflect the light back 100%, or it will bend the light, the angle of the light, causing the return color to be different than the starting color on the input of the light. Our metallic pigments are completely reflecting because they are 100% opaque, so they only reflect. And then there's another term called up converting, which are additives that are used to alter the appearance of it by using optical brighteners or fluorescent type of colorants to give a different look and a different response to the light. Excuse me. I spoke earlier about the differences between pigments and dyes, and the biggest difference is that pigment particles, they will not dissolve in their end application. They will maintain their crystallinity throughout the process. Conversely, the dyes will dissolve in their application, providing that the proper solvent is used for the solubility parameters. So you can result, if you're using a dye, you can provide or result in a solution that is not fully dissolved. So you will maintain some particle sizes, particles of the dye, if it's not if the solvent is not chosen properly to fully dissolve the dye. As I mentioned, the crystal structure is maintained with pigments, whereas it's lost with the solubility process. They both can be organic or inorganic in nature, and the end property that you receive with a pigment is a combination of the pigment chemical makeup as well as the physics of the crystals that it goes into. Whereas with the dyes, it's only determined by the chemical constitution of that particular dye. And for those who are more visual, just another example of distinguishing between the differences between a dye which is soluble and pigments which always maintain their crystallinity in a solvent, so they do not dissolve. And from the optical sense, with the particles being present in the solution, and that solution can be polymeric, it can be liquid in there, and those pigment particles are always going to absorb, scatter, and reflect the light to give you that color. Whereas in with a dyed solution, that light is going to be absorbed and transmitted through the solution. Pigment crystals and shape. This is probably one of the key areas when it comes to dispersing a pigment. The shape and the size are key in determining what kind of a formulation is required for that pigment chemistry. Obviously, you can see with the different shapes will have different surface areas. The parameter that is important is the aspect ratio, which is going to be the widest width of that particular particle divided by the thickness of the particle. So you've got your spheres, cubes, and blocks are going to be on the smaller size with respect to aspect ratio. They're going to be the easiest types of pigment crystals to disperse because their surface area is going to be the lowest in terms of dispersibility. When you get into the flakes or the needles, that's where when you have a lot of surface area available, it's going to require a unique formulation to be able to disperse those and maintain those. The other attribute with respect to pigment crystals and their shape, of course, you've got the different shapes here, a couple of examples, but there's 3 variations of the pigment particles to understand. The first being the primary particle, and this is the particle that the scientists are creating in the synthesis part of it. When we're creating that manufacture of the pigment in the synthesis stage, we are altering the process parameters, temperatures, mixing speed, addition rates, and all of those activities that create the manufacturing process, all in an effort to create the proper particles, primary particle size and shape for that chemistry. The key to note here is you will, as an end user, you will never get to the primary particle. That is developed at one time, and that's when the crystal is first formed in the synthesis. From there, those primary particles then come together in several aspects of it. The first stage is that comes together in an aggregate where a number of primary pigment particles will tightly bond together and to form, and then those aggregates will then come together in agglomerates. And The end agglomerates are what you will find in the pigment bag that you receive for your end application. And then from there, the job of the end user of the pigment would be to disperse those agglomerates, which are loosely bound, down to the aggregate size. And that is a test of how efficient the formulation and the dispersion process is if you can get to the aggregate size during your dispersion process. The other part about pigment size is it will also impact the end color of your finished dispersion. This is a busy chart. There's a lot here, but I wanted to give you a sense of how a smaller particle size during your dispersion will result in a color shift versus a larger one, so that you would get a feel for how you can make adjustments in your dispersion process with respect to the pigment that you're dispersing. So for example, if you have an orange pigment and you grind to a smaller and smaller size, that pigment is going to develop more of a yellower color. Whereas if you leave it to the larger size, it's going to be on the redder side. And similarly, if you are using a blue, grinding it to or dispersing it to the smaller size will move it greener, while leaving it on the larger size will produce a redder hue for that particular pigment. So you can get a feel for each of the color families, where size will help you with your color choices with respect to dispersion endpoint. The only caveat that I mentioned here is in the red area, where it usually goes opposite with quinacodones. They typically go bluer when they're smaller and yellower when they're larger. So quinacodones tend to have the opposite effect with respect to particle size. Pigment classification. There are a lot of ways to talk pigments, if you will, and each person and their background will favor a different way of identifying the pigment for their needs. This dates back to a lot of years ago when the Society of Dyers and Coloristics out of the United Kingdom came together to try to put together a system of identifying pigments so that they're easily identified on a first look, so you have an idea of what you're working with. Of course, then there's the American Chemical Society for the CAS number. There is an equal European chemical agencies, and of course, then also there's the FDA that has their needs as well. So I've provided for you 6 ways to identify a pigment red 57-1. We most time identify it by the color index name, but there's also a color index number associated with each pigment. Obviously, we all are very familiar with the CAS number, which is unique to that particular pigment chemistry. The European inventory has their version as well. And of course, the FDA will assign an identification to that one as well. And of course, then you have numerous types of industrial names, whether it is the full chemistry name or a kind of a nickname chemistry name that goes along with that particular one. So there are many ways to identify a pigment. So don't be concerned if if you think we're talking apples and oranges. Sometimes we just need to get on the same verbiage page that is there. Okay. Oops. Here we go. So as far as the classification, it's not a difficult process, and I'm giving you a few basics for those of you who may not be as familiar with how it comes to be. There's just three items that you need to know about the pigment to understand what exactly it is. The first one, of course, is the first letters that show up in that color index name. And our pigments are designated with a P, of course. Dyes could be either a D for dispersed dyes or SD for solvent dye. So you get a flavor of what that colorant type is by that first initial letter. Of course, the second in the naming scenario is a measure of what the hue will be for that one. Obviously, we've got the red, orange, yellow, green, that scenario where you have a lot of B words, where you got B for blue. Sometimes you will see a BL for blue, brown and black in there as well. The metallics, you rarely see these identified as that, because it's a very rarely used one, but there is a pigment M that is active and used. And of course, then the last number is the actual pigment index number, and these are assigned in a sequential basis by the society, and as those chemistries come to existence in the industry, that's when they're added in there. So you'll see a long history in some of the pigment color spaces, and there can be gaps as the pigments themselves become obsolete, or they're removed for some reason from the industry naming systems. So you'll see some gaps over time. Just some examples, just to give you a flavor to how to bring all three of them together. And then the only other piece that I wanted to point out would be to identify that sometimes you'll see additional information in there with a colon. And what that allows us to do is to give some further identification about the makeup of that particular pigment by use of a colon and a number behind the colon. So in this example, I'm showing you the kind of the base pigment red 57. And in this particular case, it is has a sodium on the backbone of the structure. When you have a 57:1, that indicates that it's going to be a calcium in that same spot on the structure. And a 57:2 will then have the barium ion in that particular structure. And so with the color index name and number identification also comes the number, very unique. It carries that same colon with it. And obviously the CAS number and the INEX number are unique as well to those particular pigments. And then the overall classification for colorants, as we stated, we already talked about, we start with either pigments or dyes, and pigments can go in the, either be organic or inorganic. And then there's many chemistries with respect to organic, got the polycyclic, azo, and metal complex. And of course, in the azo area, you've got the mono and the diazo area. And there's many areas in the inorganic as well that you can see here. So we can generalize, you can follow the pathway through for the type of colorant that you're using. To get more specific, you can, I've added some examples for each of the color areas. Here are the inorganic pigments. So you get an idea of how some of the specific pigments fall into the area. Here we've got our titanium dioxides. We've got our kind of some what we tend to call fillers in calcium carbonates and bariums in the non-opaque white areas. Clays fall into that category. On the colored side, we've got our naturals and the synthetics, where the CICPs and metal oxides come into. Our heavy metals come into that characteristics. We've got you know, that general category of others, where we've got the metallic, and we've got some carbon black, and our effect pigments. The micas fall into that category as well. On the organic side, you can kind of get again some chemistry examples that fall into these three areas. And you might have heard in general that there are, you know, with the use of the term high performance and classical with respect to pigments. And really that's more of a timeline type of an example than anything else, where the classicals were some of the original ones that were developed, and the higher performance ones were more recent. As the name suggests, in most areas, they do give higher performance in there. So the name is good in some respects, but can be a little deceiving in others. Physical parameters, there are many physical parameters with respect to a colorant, any colorant in pigments in particular. A lot of these types of physical parameters you might see on a COA for a pigment. Others are used in the manufacturing and testing of a pigment, so that the end product is where it needs to be for that application. But the important thing to consider is that every pigment parameter can directly impact the performance in the application with which you want to use that pigment. So it's important to understand the actual parameters that you have and that you need for your application. As I said earlier, Sudarshan is in the plastics and coatings and inks application areas, and we have a lot of color indexes in each of those areas, and so the physical parameters for those pigments in each of those areas will be different, and they may help in your application, or they may be a deterrent in your application. So it's good to know what your application requires for that end result, to get the best out of your application as possible. Just a quick summary of the difference between organic and inorganic. Typically, the organics are going to be smaller in particle size. They will have a lower specific gravity. They will also have a higher oil absorption value, which will make them more difficult, more not necessarily more difficult, but more needy with respect to dispersion. However, they do bring a brighter and cleaner and more, a broader palette for color. They typically always bring more higher tinting strength to your end color. There's always a potential, because of the organic nature of it, that there might be some solvent bleeding in that particular chemistry. So that's something to be checked along the way. From a fastness perspective, whether it be light fastness or heat fastness, they can be moderate to good, depending on the chemistry, versus typically the inorganics tend to be always on the good side for that one. And of course, cost is always a consideration with respect to organic versus inorganic. So there's going to be a wider range of cost for organics versus the inorganics. Pigment selection process. This is never an easy one. It can be a difficult one, but it also can be a process that is very straightforward and has some very definite needs. Obviously, a pigment is always only going to be as valuable if it performs what you in the correct manner that you need it to for your application. If it doesn't perform, it's of no use to you. So it's always good to understand what's required for the application and how to match a pigment to that application requirement. As I said, each market has a unique set of technical requirements. The process is pretty straightforward. These are only a few of the key areas to consider. Obviously, color is going to be the primary area. You need to be able to get the color space that you need. This also might be a balance between color and other properties as well. So that's a consideration to pay attention to as you go along. Bleed resistance, as I mentioned, is another area to consider. Heat resistance, especially in the plastics area, or powder coating is another area where the heat temperatures are important. This could also be in the coatings area where your end customers' curing ovens are kind of out of control in there. So you might receive a inconsistent heat profile for the coating. Chemical resistance, of course, is important. The end product will see, whether it's interior or exterior, it will see different types of chemicals on the surface of that particular end product. So the coating itself needs to be resistant, and the pigment plays a part in that overall resistance of the coating or plastic. Durability weathering is always an important one with respect to anything that's for outdoors. And cost and value is a consideration. And cost is the obvious one. You know, you have the pound for pound cost comparison when you're putting together a formulation. But value is something that can be out there that you don't necessarily always consider. And one example that I have for you is in terms of strength. In a color index, there could be multiple examples of a product in that same color index with various tint strengths, for example. And so a product that has a much higher tint strength can give you a higher value in use than the same one with the lower one. So you would use less to get the same strength ultimately in your end product in there. So there's a bit more value in use with respect to some properties. So that's what I have for this session. Looks like I'm about right on time for what I had planned for this one. Our next session will be October 27th. Again, it's the last Tuesday of the month at 11 o'clock Eastern time. It'll be formatted very similarly to this, and the subject will be phthalocyanine pigments, both green and blue. And for those who want to potentially mark their calendars in December, we will have a series on micas and manufacturing for our December series. And with that, just a quick shout out with respect to Sudarshan. They have, as I mentioned, we are in the coatings, plastics, inks, and cosmetics areas. And just to give you a feel for some of our more recent color brochures. So if there's any information that you are interested in, just please reach out to us, and we will take it from there. So now, if there's any questions, I'd like to open it up. I do see one question on the chat box that is regarding, say, when you mention smaller and larger particle size affecting shades of pigments, what are the micron sizes? Oh, that's a tough one. So this is really, this slide was intended to be in your end process, in your end dispersion process, and to give you a sense of how to alter more passes, longer grinding time, or more extrusion time with respect to your end color results. So if you wanted to move the shade one way or the other, that would be one way to alter your end dispersion process to get to that shade. So the actual particle size that you are achieving is really dependent on your formulation, your application, and your dispersion process. But it's really geared towards helping you to alter either more or less your dispersion process to be able to work with the color shade differences. All right, we've got another question that came through. Do you have any new pigments for bright shades that satisfy super durable weathering requirements? Okay, so for the super durable area, I'm not sure what you're looking for as far as super durable, but those pigments that are in the high performance category are going to be the best performing with respect to weathering in there. So if you're looking for brighter shades, we've got our on the yellow side, your yellow 151s, your yellow 154s. To the yellow orange side, you've got your yellow 139 and your orange 36. In the red side, you've got, depending on where you want to be, you've got your red 170s and your red 264. So as long as you're on the high performance side of the equation with respect to organic pigments, you're going to have improved and higher durable pigments. Okay, okay, here comes another question. If I understand correctly, the aggregate size is the smallest that we can achieve during the normal pigment distribution. Is that size published on the TDS? It would help us determine when we were finished grinding. No, the TDS are typically will do things on the TDS is both the average particle size, but also the particle size distribution, and those are more the agglomerate size areas for that one. So the TDS would be the agglomerate size, not the aggregate size. The aggregate size is what will result in your dispersion process. Are there any new organics pigments under development, new CI numbers? To be honest, the development of new CIs is very difficult. I will not underestimate that task in there. And so, however, it's not to say that pigment manufacturing companies aren't trying to develop new CIs. In today's world, there are very few that come out in there. So, however, if you want to find the most recent CIs, you can get an idea of that by looking at the actual CI number. So I mentioned that they're assigned chronologically. So if you wanted to find the most recent, you look for the highest CI number. So for example, you've got in the yellow space, for example, you've got pigment yellow 74 was developed way earlier than pigment yellow 139, for example. So that'll give you a clue as to how often these in there. Does Sudarshan commercially sell dyes? I have a need for that. And
there were a couple of questions about that, Bonnie.
Okay. In there, so we can get back to that. We are going into that direction. So I will say they will come along in the next 6 months or so, 3 to 6 months. Is there a way to offset high oil absorption? This can be the end oil absorption certainly can be altered by the physical makeup of the pigment, by use of oils. As it also is dependent on surface area as well as additives that are used within the pigment itself. So a smaller crystal shape and size, of course, as I mentioned earlier, will have the higher oil absorption than say a cube with a very small oil aspect ratio. The presentation file,
There was one question above, which will, the question is from Jerry. Will there be future discussions on how different organic pigments receive surface treatment or contain extender?
Yes, so as we go forward into the series, for example, our next one will be for the fallows. In those presentation, I will give you a feel for how the manufacture of that impacts the end properties, as well as uses in additives and surfactants and surface treatments and other additives, and how they impact. So yes, the answer to that will be yes in the future ones.
And then from the chronological part, the next one would be, will you share the presentation file?
Yes.
By request, you mail it out, or how you plan on sharing it?
I will share that.
Yeah, but how will you share it? Will you send it out to everybody, or is this by request?
No, I will send it out to all of the participants in the call.
Mm-hmm. And then you see the question on the bottom. Now we're on the bottom. This one. Do you know?
Not that I know of.
Going back to your question, we shall just on the dyes. Because there's so many different dyes, just to specify what Bonnie mentioned, we are launching basically a line of solvent dyes, which is in the final stages. So we are focusing on solvent dyes initially.
Great. All right. Okay, I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so I'm going to cut the question and answers. If there's anything more that you have questions, feel free to reach out to us and we'll get back to you for that. And with that, I thank you for everything that that you or for your participation in this, and we look forward next month for our next Lunch and Learn. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Bonnie.
No problem.
Yeah, Bonnie.